nature nut, I'm not afraid to admit. I'm wild about the wild things and I'm proud of it. I'm just a simple case, open and shut. No doubt about it, I'm a nature nut. Today we'll go bird watching, tomorrow we'll catch toads. The next day we'll take photographs of bugs along the road. I never get the feeling that I'm in a rut. That's why I'm a nature nut. Well, I'm a nature nut, I'm not afraid to admit. I'm wild about the wild things and I'm proud of it. I'm just a simple case, open and shut. No doubt about it, I'm a nature nut.
Well, hello there, fellow nature nuts. What do you say today we go looking for trout? You know, the fish, trout. I know what you're saying. You're saying this is not a fishing show, and you're right, it's not. But I have to admit that there was a time in my life when I was a fanatic fly fisherman for trout. I just loved it. Every spare minute I had, I went out on the streams. I tried to catch trout. Now, you might think that fishermen and naturalists are fundamentally different people, but the fact is the two, they really overlap in a big way. Many of the best trout fishermen I know, they're great naturalists. They know a whole lot about trout and trout environments, the other animals that live in the same places as trout food insects, things like that. And many of the best naturalists I know are also good trout fishermen themselves. So, I think you're going to find this interesting. I think you're going to really like trout if you don't like them already. And as long as you remember, despite the spectacle you see before you, this is not a fishing show.
Trout are related not only to salmon and char, but to whitefish and grayling as well.
We know streams are complicated places, and trout don't live just anywhere in a stream. What they want a good feeding station. In fact, they want it so bad that they will defend a good feeding station against other trout. For example, down that bend there's a nice shallow, fast-flowing spot. It looks good. There's undoubtedly a lot of food, a lot of insects being swept over that shallow part of the stream. But if there was a trout in there, it would have to be flipping its tail all day, fighting against the current. It wouldn't be worth the effort, except on a very warm day when the trout have got a lot of energy. There probably aren't any trout in this calm bay behind me either, because there's not much current, so there's not much food there. Now, I'm in what we call the inside of this bend of the creek, and the water here is quite shallow. But if you go to the outside of the bend where the main current is, the water gets much deeper because the current is digging into the stream bed and forming a nice deep spot. I mean, that's deep. So if I were a trout, there's no doubt that there's a trout here. I would be hiding under this mat of floating vegetation, waiting for nice juicy bugs to come floating on by. Either that or I'd be under that overhanging willow on the outside of the next bend up the creek. That's where you watch for trout, and there's no doubt that there's one right there, looking at my legs and wishing I'd get the heck out of here.
Trout lay their eggs in gravel beds, so silt in the gravel is a bad thing in a trout stream.
Okay, well now let's talk about what the trout are feeding on. They're feeding on what we call the drift. And the drift is just a matter of a whole bunch of little tiny critters that basically drift downstream with the current. Most of them are insect larvae, things like that, you know, young insects. And I'm just gonna use the net here to see what we can get in the way of drift. This is a secret creek, by the way. I'm not gonna tell you where it is. It's a tradition among trout fishermen. Never tell anybody where the trout are. It's kind of silly because everybody knows and you like to brag about it. Anyway, let's have a look. Okay, well there's a scud in there, and a scud is a sort of a crustacean. A lot of people call them freshwater shrimp, but really they're scuds, they're not shrimp. Trout eat a lot of scuds, and the scud was probably on the plants, hanging on there before I disturbed it. And we've also got a mayfly larva here, a young mayfly. These little guys, they'll crawl around on plants or rocks and they eat mostly algae. And remember, every night they're drifting a little further downstream. So when they turn into adult mayflies with wings, they have to fly back upstream, because otherwise, of course, all the mayflies in the world would wind up down in the ocean. And it's kind of nice, isn't it? You spend your whole young life just drifting with the current, and your adult life flapping back up to where you started from.
Right now I'm looking for adult insects on the water's surface. What we're waiting for is the emergence of adult insects from their larvae or their pupae, depending on what kind of insects we're talking about, and we want to see them on the surface of the water so the trout can pick them off. There are 3 groups of insects that are really, really important to trout, that trout really seem to go for. And I've been snooping around the bushes here. I've got examples of all 3. This one here is a caddisfly. You recognize it as a caddisfly by the fact that its wings are held over the back like a little pup tent, and by the fact that it has long antennae. That's very typical of a caddisfly. And here I've got examples of the other 2 big-time trout food insect groups. This little guy with the wings held right up over the back like a little sailboat, that is a mayfly. And mayfly, oh, they're the favorite of trout fishermen because they're quite easy to imitate with fishing flies, and they're good-looking little critters in their own right. The other one, with the wings held flat over its back, is a stonefly. Stoneflies are, well, again, the larva lives in the water, the adult comes out, and stoneflies are really, really treasured morsels to trout. Some of them get to be about that big, and oh boy, the water just starts to boil with rises when the stoneflies come out.
So being a trout in a lake is very different than being a trout in a stream. You can't just sit there and wait for the food to come to you because there's no current. Trout in lakes, they have to roam around, so there could be a trout anywhere in a lake like this. Although, I don't know, midday with the sun on high, I'd expect them to be hiding in the shadows near the fallen trees and places like that. In lakes, trout are much more friendly with each other too. They're not territorial because they don't have to defend feeding stations, so sometimes they'll even school together, form pods, and roam around the lake together. It's a little bit cold for snorkeling here, so I'm going to explore this beautiful mountain lake with my float tube, underwater video camera, share some of these beautiful colors with you. Who knows, maybe we'll see a trout by accident.
When rainbow trout spend part of their life in the sea, they are called steelhead.
Okay, folks, well, the hatch is on. As you'll notice, in that slightly slower flat water near the opposite shore, there's a small fish coming to the surface. That's called a rise. Only amateurs call it jumping. The fish are jumping. Rising. Biologists would call it surface feeding. And then down in the deep water, around the next bend, just before that riffle, there's even more activity. A lot of fish are rising there. But you'll also see some of the rises, very casual, slow rises that don't bring the snout up to the surface. They're probably taking the larva just under the water's surface before it sheds its skin and emerges to fly away. You rarely see them right through the water. Mostly you just see them when they come to the surface. But it's such an exuberant, joyful thing when they come blasting up there on the rises. It's worth watching. Okay, well, let me remind you one more time, this is not a fishing show, but I figured unless I got out the fishing gear, we weren't actually going to see a trout on this episode, which would have been a shame. So, got my fly rod, put on a number 14 Royal Coachman dry fly, which imitates some sort of floating insect, nothing in particular, and I caught this trout. This is a brook trout, and you can tell that by the lovely wormy markings on its back. In trout circles, we call those vermiculations. Comes from the word vermes, which means worms. They also have blue and red haloed spots on the sides, orange fins with white and black leading edges. This is a great looking fish. I mean, if it didn't mind room temperature water, it'd be a good aquarium fish, but don't keep trout in aquariums. It's not a good thing to do. Anyway, let me show you some sketches I did, just so we can review some other sorts of trout. Here's the brook trout that we're looking at right now. The brook trout is actually, it's a char. It's more closely related to the Dolly Varden char and the Arctic char and fish like that. Then you have a look at the rainbow trout. This is the one with the black spots and the beautiful red line along the side. The rainbow trout is actually more closely related to the Pacific salmon than to the char, and so it's really sort of an inland salmon. And then the brown trout, the one with the black and red spots on a golden background, that species of trout is more closely related to the Atlantic salmon. So the trout, as a whole, they're kind of a mishmash of fish that more or less look the same. They're more or less related to one another. They live in fresh water. They don't get too terribly big, and they're all beautiful, beautiful fish. I love them. And speaking of respect for trout, I'm just going to put my sketches down and we'll let this brook trout go. Well, you know, there have been quite a few changes in trout fishing in the last few decades. For example, most fly fishermen who fish for trout, they are now catch and release fishermen. Instead of bonking the trout on the head and taking it home for dinner, they carefully remove the hook from the mouth of the fish and let the fish go. And that has resulted in more trout in the streams and bigger trout and healthier trout populations. And many fishermen have also switched over from the barbed hook to a barbless style of hook in the hopes that they will hurt fewer fish that way. So there are some important ethical questions, but you know, in the old days, the ethical questions that surrounded fly fishing, they were even more obtuse. For example, there was a big debate about whether it was more sportsmanly to use wet flies or dry flies. These are dry flies. They float and they imitate adult insects, the surface drift. And these are nymphs, which are sort of like wet flies. They sink into the water and they imitate larvae. They imitate the underwater drift. And I'll tell you, there were some people who felt that one was correct and the other was pure evil.
To precise fish at precisely the correct time while wearing precisely the correct attire. That is the way to fish.
I don't know. You know, every time I'm out in this lovely water, all I can think of is the immortal words of Skews in his epic poem, "The beautiful brown wink from beneath the tawny brown waves."
Now, I don't think you've got the title right.
Oh.
No, that's not quite it.
Oh, the little brown bug dancing daintily among the waves.
No, that's not it either.
The smuggling dainty nymph smiling sprightly at the sailor.
At this point, you're just guessing.
Well,
The
that is...
little brown wink underwater.
Oh, I see you've read it too. It is jolly good poem.
It's a
Jolly
load
good.
of garbage, really. Piece of literary garbage. There doesn't seem to be any fish in this river, really.
Well, I heard that there was a grizzly bear here the other day, and he might have snatched them all up.
This couldn't possibly be a grizzly bear.
Well, you haven't heard about the one who escaped from the Edinburgh Zoo the other day.
Oh my goodness, that does add an edge, doesn't it?
It does indeed. Oh, wait a second. There he is now.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, no, that's just Farnsworth.
Farnsworth is...
Hello?
What do you say we discuss this ethical dilemma at the pub over a nice dry sherry?
I was thinking about a nice, cool, wet mug of beer.
Anything wet, I suppose.
Well, anything dry, I suppose.
Now, while I was out wading these secluded trout streams, my friend Michael Becker was writing the song for this show with the help of a fiddler, Tony Michaels. Now, I can't imagine what sort of song he might write cooped up in a music studio in the city, so far from the inspiration of real live trout.
Getting kind of hungry. Well, that's an idea.
I was thinking about dinner. Must have been a Friday night. Looking through the Frigidaire. The fish sounds nice tonight. But we had none, so I went out. I bought myself a lovely trout. When I was standing at the checkout, I heard somebody call. Hey, Rudy! We all want to go bowling tonight. Hey, Rudy! So don't forget your bowling shoes. Now Rudy's just a trout. Of that there's little doubt. How could he participate? I couldn't guess. I'd have to wait to find out.
I decided I would try it. I'd bring him along. His teammates were a riot. Rudy could do no wrong. Well, he was pretty good at keeping score, flipping and flopping across the floor. He kept on cheering his teammates on and on and on and on. Hey, Rudy, you're a winning son of a gun. We were winning big time. We were winning big time. Hey, Rudy, you're a winning son of a gun. After all that, I didn't feel like fish. So we went for a pizza, that was Rudy's wish.
No anchovy.
Rudy told me why I liked to bowl. I knew right then that trout had soul.
Keep on doing what you like to do. Give it all you got, it's good for you. We winning big time. We winning big time. Hey, Rudy, you're a winning son of a gun.
Another big trout story by John Acorn. In the paling light, with those uncommon purple hues of twilight cavorting on the foothills all around me, I beheld speechlessly as a bathtub-sized rise formed in the gin-clear waters of the Frenchman's Creek. That's not old square-tailed Wayne, the 4-pounder, I told myself. That young trout is too reckless. Then an enormous snout languidly broke the surface not 3 feet away with a barely audible slurp. Trying desperately not to panic, I tied on a fly, a variant number 14 Royal Trude. Detail's good if you're doing writing, always put in lots of detail. A light in the bushes caught my eye. Smallest UFO I have ever seen was hovering through the willows, killing blue-winged olive mayflies with some kind of laser beam. No time to think about that while square-tailed Wayne was rising. UFO's wrong. I'm gonna change that to some kind of bird. Alder flycatcher. There we go. That'll make it more of a nature story. Only one chance for a cast, but what was that repulsive smell? I looked up and found myself gazing into a pair of subhumanly brown eyes set in a grinning, hairy, monstrous head. Rats! It's the Sasquatch of all the rotten timing. I cried out in anguish as a tremendous V-shaped wake announced to us all that old square-tailed Wayne had left his feeding station for the night. That's not right. That's not right. We can't, I'll change the Sasquatch to Farnsworth. Yeah, what was that repulsive smell? It was old Farnsworth. It's gotta, yeah, it's funny. Okay, there we go. A couple more of these. I'll have a book. I, too, can contribute to the trout literature. Give it a go yourself. It's a lot of fun. Okay, well, here's my new theory. Here's the way I figure it. In order to really understand these trout, we gotta get in there and see the world the way they see it. I'm gonna snorkel this trout stream for you. It's a great thing to do. I've done it once before. You know, it's cold in here, but it's good. It's good. Make sure if you try this yourself, make sure to scout it in advance so you don't get stuck under some tree or fallen log or barbed wire fence or something, and always have a buddy on shore with your towel and all that kind of stuff. Okay, here we go. The world through the eyes of a trout. I got the underwater video camera. You're gonna love it. Yes. There we go. There, one last big rise. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. The world through the eyes of a trout, and trout through the eyes of a naturalist, a nature nut, a fly fisherman, whichever you choose. I hope you get out and get a look at that little brown wink underwater yourself. Actually, I looked it up. The correct title of the poem is Little Brown Wink by G.E.M. Skews. It's a wonderful read. I love that kind of stuff. That's why I'm a nature nut, and I hope you are too. See you again soon.
Same time each and every week, uncensored and uncut. No doubt about it, I'm a nature nut.